The cold morning air bit through Oberleutnant Karl Müller's flight jacket as he stood on the tarmac of Juvincourt airfield in northern France. It was October 14, 1943, 7:32 hours. The scent of damp earth, aviation fuel, and the faint metallic tang of fear hung in the air, though Müller would never admit to that last part. At 26 years old, with 48 confirmed victories painted in neat black swastikas below his cockpit, and the Knight's Cross hanging heavy around his neck, he represented everything the Luftwaffe wanted its fighter pilots to be: confident, experienced, and utterly convinced of German aerial superiority. Through his leather-gloved hand, he could feel the familiar vibration of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G-6's Daimler-Benz DB 605 engine as it warmed up. The sound was a symphony he knew by heart, the deep-throated rumble that promised power, speed, and another day of hunting what his comrades dismissively called jabos, their slang for American fighter-bombers. "Another milk run, Karl," called out his wingman, Lieutenant Hans Vogel, climbing into his own 109 nearby. Vogel, at 22, still had the fresh-faced enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet seen enough combat to understand how quickly fortunes could change in the air war over Europe. Müller gave a tight smile. "Let's hope the Amis send us something worth shooting at today. I'm tired of these P-47s that run at the first sign of trouble." What Müller couldn't know, as he settled into the familiar confines of his cockpit, was that everything he understood about aerial combat, everything the Luftwaffe had taught him through 4 years of war, was about to be violently rewritten. The reports his intelligence officers had dismissed as exaggerated propaganda, the rumors whispered by returning pilots who'd encountered something different over Germany, the scattered pieces of information that didn't fit the established narrative of American inferiority. They were all about to converge in the skies above Schweinfurt in a way that would shock the German fighter arm to its core. The confidence displayed by Müller and his comrades wasn't mere bravado. It was built on 2 years of overwhelming success against American daylight bombing campaigns. Since the first B-17 formations had appeared over German-occupied territory in 1942, Luftwaffe pilots had compiled kill ratios that seemed to validate their sense of superiority. Through the spring and summer of 1943, German fighter pilots routinely achieved kill ratios of 3:1 or better against American escort fighters. The official Luftwaffe assessment, circulated just weeks earlier, stated confidently, "The American P-47 Thunderbolt is too heavy, lacks maneuverability at altitude, and possesses insufficient range to pose a serious threat to Reich air defense." This assessment wasn't entirely wrong, based on the P-47Cs that German intelligence had studied through early 1943. But while German analysts were writing reports based on captured documents and observations from 6 months prior, something extraordinary was happening in factories across America, something that would soon make those assessments not just outdated, but dangerously wrong. The numbers told a story of German confidence. In the first 9 months of 1943, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had claimed 1847 American aircraft shot down against 614 German losses, a nearly perfect 3:1 ratio that seemed to confirm their tactical and technological edge. German pilots flew aircraft that were, on paper and in most combat situations, superior to what the Americans fielded. The Bf 109 G-6 that Müller flew that morning could climb to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes, outturned most American fighters at high altitude, and packed a devastating punch with its engine-mounted cannon firing through the propeller hub. What the German high command failed to grasp, what they actively dismissed in intelligence briefings, was the sheer industrial capacity being unleashed across the Atlantic. While German factories struggled to produce 650 Bf 109s per month across all variants, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale, New York plant alone was churning out 15 P-47 Thunderbolts every single day. And these weren't the same aircraft German pilots had encountered in early 1943. These were P-47D models with water injection, paddle blade propellers, and newly designed wing pylons that would soon carry drop tanks, modifications that would extend their range deep into Germany itself. The technological gap was closing faster than any German analyst predicted. At the Republic Aviation Plant, a team led by Russian-born engineer Alexander Kartveli had been working 16-hour days to solve the P-47's two critical weaknesses: high-altitude performance and combat range. Kartveli, who had fled the Russian Revolution and brought his engineering genius to America, understood something fundamental that German designers often missed. In mass warfare, reliability and survivability mattered more than theoretical perfection. His solution to the high-altitude problem was both elegant and brutally effective. The P-47D now featured a revised turbo-supercharger system that maintained power up to 35,000 feet, higher than most Bf-109s could effectively operate. While German engineers focused on making their aircraft lighter and more maneuverable, Kartveli embraced the Thunderbolt's weight, using it to create a stable gun platform that could dive at speeds no German fighter could match. The 850 caliber machine guns each carried 425 rounds, giving the P-47 more sustained firepower than any German fighter. And the aircraft could absorb battle damage that would shred a Bf-109 or FW-190 to pieces. But the most important innovation, the one that would truly shock German pilots like Müller, wasn't the aircraft itself, but what it carried under its wings. The new 108-gallon disposable paper drop tanks, produced by a cardboard company in Ohio, could be jettisoned when empty, giving the P-47s the range to fly deep into Germany and back. This single innovation, seemingly minor, would negate Germany's primary defensive strategy, waiting until American fighters had to turn back due to fuel constraints before pouncing on the bombers. The first hints that something had changed began appearing in German intelligence reports in late September 1943. On September 27, a returning Bf-109 pilot reported engaging P-47s near Aachen, well beyond their previously known combat radius. The report was filed with a notation: pilot likely disoriented or mistaken about location. 3 days later, another pilot reported P-47s maintaining formation with B-17s as far east as Kassel. This report was marked, exaggerated, physically impossible based on known P-47 fuel capacity. The warnings continued throughout early October. On October 4, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 pilot barely escaped an engagement with P-47s near Frankfurt, reporting that the American fighters climbed as well as our aircraft and dove much faster. His squadron commander dismissed the report, noting that the pilot is inexperienced and likely panicked in his first major engagement. Even more telling were the encrypted signals intelligence that German monitoring stations began picking up. American bomber formations were transmitting navigation coordinates that placed them much deeper into Germany than previously possible with fighter escort. German intelligence analysts attributed this to likely deception measures, rather than considering the possibility that American fighter range had dramatically increased. The most prescient warning came from Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, who had reviewed the accumulating reports with growing concern. On October 8, he sent a memorandum to Luftwaffe High Command stating, "There are indications the Americans may have solved the range limitation problems with their escort fighters. We should consider the possibility that they can now reach targets in central Germany." The response from General Hans Jeskinek, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, was dismissive. Technical impossibility based on known fuel consumption rates. Do not spread alarmist theories. This institutional disbelief ran deep. German intelligence estimates placed maximum P-47 range at 375 miles, enough to reach the German border but no further. The actual range with drop tanks was 525 miles, enough to reach Schweinfurt and beyond. This 150-mile discrepancy would prove catastrophic for the Luftwaffe's defense strategy. Meanwhile, at Juvincourt, Karl Müller completed his pre-flight checks with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. The familiar routine comforted him. Fuel mixture rich, propeller pitch set, canopy locked, oxygen flow checked. He glanced at the black and white photograph of his fiancée Lena tucked into his instrument panel, her smiling face a reminder of what he was fighting for. Then he pushed such thoughts away. In the air, sentimentality got you killed. Yellow flight, prepare for takeoff, crackled the voice of his Gruppenkommandeur through the headset. Intel reports heavy bomber formations crossing the channel. Destination unknown. Müller felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Another day, another chance to defend the Reich against the terror bombers. He still believed what he'd been told in briefing after briefing, that American fighters were inferior, their pilots poorly trained, their tactics unimaginative. The war in the air would be won by German skill and engineering superiority. What he didn't know was that at that exact moment, 247 P-47 Thunderbolts were climbing through broken clouds over England, their new paper drop tanks still full, their pilots briefed on a new tactic called fighter sweep that would take them deep into Germany ahead of the bomber stream. And among those pilots were men who had studied German tactics, who knew exactly how the Luftwaffe liked to attack bombers, and who were equipped with aircraft that could now meet the Germans on equal terms, or better. The first indication that this day would be different came at 8:17 hours, as Müller's swarm of 4 Bf-109s reached their patrol altitude of 24,000 feet near Aachen. Through the light haze, he could see the contrails of the American bomber stream, hundreds of B-17s moving with the relentless determination that always impressed and angered him in equal measure. Bomber sighted, 12 o'clock high, he transmitted calmly. No fighter escort visible. Standard procedure. The Americans usually positioned their fighters ahead and above the bombers, but they'd have to turn back soon, leaving the B-17s vulnerable to the gathered German fighter force. Müller estimated they had maybe 20 minutes before the P-47s reached their fuel limits and had to abandon the bombers. Then his wingman Vogel's voice, slightly higher pitched than usual. Karl, contacts at 3 o'clock low, multiple bandits. Müller glanced to his right. Through the scattered clouds he saw them, a formation of P-47s but much larger than usual. He counted quickly. 16, maybe 20, and they weren't turning away. They were climbing, angling to position themselves between the German fighters and the bombers. Stay calm, Müller transmitted. They're bluffing. They'll break off in 5 minutes when their fuel warning lights come on. But 5 minutes came and went. The P-47s maintained formation, their distinctive razorback silhouettes looking somehow different, more menacing. Müller noticed something else. They were carrying large underwing tanks, but these looked different from the metal tanks he'd seen before. They appeared to be made of some lighter material. At 8:29, the P-47s did something unprecedented. Instead of turning back toward England, they jettisoned their drop tanks in near unison. The paper containers fluttered away, and suddenly the Thunderbolts were free of their extra weight, climbing with an agility that made Müller's breath catch in his throat. "That's not possible," Vogel said over the radio, his voice tight. "They should be turning back now." Müller didn't respond. He was doing quick calculations in his head. They were nearly 200 miles into German airspace. The P-47s should have been at the absolute limit of their range. Yet here they were, clearly preparing to engage. The German ground controller's voice cut through, confused. "Yellow flight, be advised we show you approximately 180 kilometers from initial point of contact. Confirm escort fighter presence." Müller keyed his microphone. "Confirmed." Approximately 20 P-47s, they've just. He never finished the sentence. The P-47s, now free of their drop tanks, turned into the German formation with a speed and aggression that Müller had never seen from American pilots before. They didn't make the cautious, predictable moves he'd come to expect. They came in fast, in elements of two, covering each other with professional precision. "Break left," Müller shouted as two thunderbolts dove on Vogel's aircraft. The sky exploded into chaos. The familiar ballet of aerial combat that Müller had mastered, the energy fighting, the boom and zoom tactics that favored the lighter German fighters, suddenly seemed obsolete against these new opponents. Müller pulled his 109 into a climbing turn, expecting the heavier P-47s to overshoot. Instead, the lead Thunderbolt matched his turn, its .850 caliber guns beginning to wink ominously. Tracers reached for his aircraft, and Müller felt the first cold trickle of real fear. This wasn't the inaccurate spraying he was used to from American pilots. These shots were tightly grouped, aimed with lethal precision. "Karl, they're staying with us in the turn," Vogel yelled, his voice edged with panic. Impossible, Müller thought. The P-47s were supposed to be sluggish in horizontal maneuvers, but this one stuck to his tail as if connected by a wire. He tried another standard evasion, a sudden pushover into a dive. The Bf-109 picked up speed rapidly, the wind screaming through the airframe. He glanced back. The P-47 was still there and gaining. In a dive, nothing could catch a 109. Nothing, except this P-47 was gaining. Rapidly. Müller's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The performance figures he'd memorized, the tactical advice he'd given to new pilots, the entire framework of his air combat experience, all of it was wrong. Dangerously wrong. All units, a frantic voice crackled over the radio. It was Major Schneider leading another staffel nearby. "The P-47s have drop tanks. They're staying with the bombers all the way to the target." The radio net dissolved into confused transmissions. Pilots reporting engagements far deeper into Germany than should have been possible. Controllers trying to make sense of radar returns that showed fighter contacts where none should exist. Müller finally managed to shake the P-47 by diving to treetop level and using cloud cover. His heart hammered against his ribs, his mouth dry. He'd never been so thoroughly outflown in 4 years of combat. The American pilot hadn't just been good. He'd flown with a confidence that suggested he knew his aircraft could do things German intelligence said was impossible. Climbing back to altitude, Müller rejoined what was left of his swarm. Vogel was still with him, but the other two pilots were nowhere to be seen. "Karl, what in God's name was that?" Vogel asked, his voice shaking. "They flew like they owned the sky." Müller didn't have an answer. He looked at his fuel gauge. They'd been airborne for less than an hour, but the intense combat had burned through his reserves. They'd need to land soon to refuel and rearm. Then he saw it. Through a break in the clouds below, the distinctive ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt sprawled along the main river. The primary target. And circling above it, not just the 20 P-47s they'd initially encountered, but dozens more. Maybe 60, 70 American fighters, all still there, all still protecting the bombers. His stomach clenched. The briefings, the intelligence estimates, the confident assessments from high command, they had all been wrong. Not just slightly off, but catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. "Yellow flight, this is control." The ground controller's voice had lost its professional calm. "We're tracking multiple additional fighter formations approaching from the west. Estimate 80+ bandits, all P-47s, all carrying external tanks. 80+. The number didn't seem real. Where were they all coming from? How had American production and technology advanced so far, so fast, without German intelligence noticing? Müller keyed his microphone, his voice tight. "Control, confirm numbers. Did you say 80+ Thunderbolts?" "Affirmative, Yellow Leader. And there's more. We're getting reports of P-38 lightnings engaging near Frankfurt, also with extended range. The implications hit Müller like a physical blow. If the Americans could provide fighter escort all the way to Schweinfurt, one of the most distant targets in their bombing campaign, then nowhere in Germany was safe. The carefully constructed air defense system, built around attacking bombers after their fighter cover turned back, was suddenly obsolete. He looked at the formations of P-47s below. They flew with an assurance he'd never seen before, positioning themselves between the German fighters and the bombers with professional efficiency. These weren't the hesitant, inexperienced pilots he'd been told to expect. These were veterans flying aircraft that could match or exceed the performance of his Bf-109. "Karl, we're bingo fuel," Vogel reminded him. "We need to disengage." Müller glanced at his gauge. Vogel was right. They had maybe 20 minutes of combat time left. The P-47s below probably had more, much more. He was about to give the order to break off when something else caught his eye. High above, contrails were forming, not the straight, purposeful lines of bombers but the curling, intersecting patterns of fighters engaged in combat. Lots of fighters. "Control, Yellow Leader. What's happening at high altitude? We're seeing multiple engagements above 30,000 feet. The response took a moment, as if the controller was struggling to process the information himself. "Yellow Leader, we're tracking. We're tracking approximately 40 additional bandits at Angels 3-5. Appear to be more P-47s. 40 more." The numbers kept growing. Müller tried to calculate the total American fighter presence. The initial 20 they'd engaged, the 80 the controller had reported, now 40 more at high altitude. Nearly 150 American fighters, all deep inside Germany, all at once. It was an air force. A complete, coordinated fighter sweep of a scale nobody in the Luftwaffe High Command had believed possible. All units, all units." A new voice cut in, sharp with urgency. It was Oberleutnant Walther, the regional fighter commander. "Break off all engagements with bombers. I repeat, break off. Concentrate on the escort fighters. They're the primary threat." The order was unprecedented. German fighter doctrine had always prioritized destroying bombers. The escorts were supposed to be avoided or drawn away, not engaged directly. For Walther to reverse years of established tactics meant something fundamental had changed. Müller led his reduced swarm toward the high-altitude fight. As they climbed, he saw the contrails thickening, the sky filled with the evidence of a battle on a scale he'd never witnessed. Dozens of aircraft twisting, turning, diving, and most of them were P-47s. At 32,000 feet, the air was thin and cold. Müller's oxygen mask felt tight against his face as he scanned the sky. The battle was chaotic, but patterns emerged. The P-47s flew in elements of two, covering each other with a discipline that matched the best German units. They used their diving speed to make slashing attacks, then used their newfound climb performance to regain altitude. He saw a Bf-109 try to turn with a P-47, a fatal mistake. The Thunderbolt stayed inside the 109's turn radius, its 850 calipers walking rounds into the German fighter's wing route. The 109 shuddered, then pieces began flying off. The pilot belayed out, his parachute opening just as his aircraft disintegrated. Another 109 tried the classic German tactic, a high-side attack followed by a zoom climb away. The P-47 simply pointed its nose up and followed, its engine producing power at an altitude where the DB-605 should have had the advantage. Nothing was working. The tactics Müller had spent years perfecting, the moves that had earned him 48 victories, were suddenly useless against these improved Thunderbolts flown by confident, aggressive pilots. "Karl, we've got 2 on our 6, Vogel shouted. Müller broke hard left, his G-suit tightening around his legs as the force pressed him into his seat. The 2 P-47s stuck with him, their radial engines producing a distinctive growl that grew louder as they closed. He tried everything: sharp turns, sudden climbs, rapid descents. The P-47s matched him move for move. They weren't just hanging on, they were gaining. For the first time in his combat career, Karl Müller felt truly outclassed. Not by a better pilot, but by a better weapons system. The aircraft on his tail represented a technological and industrial leap that Germany simply couldn't match. His fuel warning light began blinking red. He was down to his last 20 minutes of flight time. The P-47s behind him probably had twice that. "Yellow flight, emergency disengage," he transmitted. "Dive to deck and head for home." He pushed the stick forward, his 109 nosing down into a near-vertical dive. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly: 400, 450, 500 kilometers per hour. The wind screamed through every gap in the airframe. He glanced back. The P-47s were still there, and gaining. Impossible. Nothing could catch a diving 109. Nothing. Yet the distance kept shrinking. The thunderbolts grew larger in his mirror, their distinctive cowlings and razorback fuselages looking increasingly menacing. At 5,000 feet, Müller pulled out of the dive, his vision graying from the G-forces. The P-47s pulled out with him, smooth and controlled. They were now close enough that he could see the individual gun ports in their wings. He tried a last, desperate maneuver, a hard right turn followed by a sudden left reversal. The P-47s anticipated the move, the lead aircraft cutting inside his turn, while the wingman maintained position to block any escape. They were herding him, like experienced sheepdogs working a stray back toward the flock. Müller's mind raced, searching for some tactic, some trick he hadn't tried. Nothing came. The P-47s had countered every move he'd made, flying with a confidence that suggested they knew his aircraft's capabilities better than he did. He looked at his fuel gauge again. 15 minutes, maybe less if he kept flying at combat power. The radio was chaos. Pilots calling for help, reporting engagements, shouting warnings. The professional calm of the Luftwaffe fighter arm had shattered in the space of 30 minutes. "They're everywhere, I can't shake. My engine's hit, oil pressure dropping. Any unit, I've got 4 on my tail near Wurzburg. Break right, Erich, break right." Too late. The voices painted a picture of a battle going catastrophically wrong across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. This wasn't a local reversal. This was a systemic collapse. Müller risked another glance behind him. The two P-47s were closer now, maybe 400 meters back. They hadn't fired yet. They didn't need to. They had him exactly where they wanted him. He tried one more climb, hoping his lighter aircraft could still outclimb the thunderbolts at lower altitude. The P-47s followed, their engines producing a deep, powerful roar that sounded different from the 109's higher-pitched whine. At 8,000 feet, his climb rate began to fall off. The P-47s continued climbing as if they had all the power in the world. Then the lead P-47 did something that made Müller's blood run cold. It eased off slightly, dropping back to his wingman's position. They flew formation for a moment, then the wingman moved up to take the lead position. They were rotating, conserving fuel. They had no intention of breaking off. They could stay with him all the way back to his airfield if they wanted to. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just about winning a single air battle. This was about demonstrating complete and total air superiority. The Americans weren't just escorting bombers today. They were proving they could go anywhere in Germany, stay as long as they wanted, and defeat anything the Luftwaffe sent against them. His fuel warning light began blinking more urgently. 10 minutes of flight time remaining. He had to land soon, and the P-47s knew it. He looked at the photograph of Lena on his instrument panel. Her smiling face seemed to belong to another world, a world where German technological superiority was unquestioned, where Luftwaffe pilots ruled the skies over Europe, where the outcome of the air war wasn't in doubt. That world, he realized with sudden, chilling clarity, no longer existed. The lead P-47 moved back into position behind him, closing the distance slowly, deliberately. Müller could see the sunlight glinting off the pilot's canopy. He imagined the American pilot calmly tracking him, waiting for the right moment to fire. He tried the radio one more time. "Any Juvincourt unit, this is Yellow Leader. I have 2 bandits on my tail approximately 15 kilometers west of base. Request assistance." Silence. Then a strained voice responded, one of the ground controllers. "Yellow Leader, negative on assistance. All available units are engaged. Multiple emergencies across the sector. Multiple emergencies." The phrase was so inadequate, so bureaucratic for what was happening. This wasn't multiple emergencies. This was the collapse of an entire air defense system. Müller looked at his fuel gauge. 5 minutes. He had to land now, with the P-47 still on his tail. He transmitted a mayday, the first of his career. "Juvincourt Tower, Yellow Leader declaring emergency. Bingo fuel, bandits on my 6, requesting emergency landing clearance." The tower responded immediately, the controller's voice tight with stress. "Yellow Leader cleared immediate landing. Runway 27, anti-aircraft batteries are alerted." As if flak would help against fighters that could outdive, outclimb, and apparently outfly anything the Luftwaffe possessed. Müller began his landing approach, his eyes constantly flicking to the mirror. The 2 P-47s had dropped back slightly but maintained position. They weren't attacking. They were escorting him home. The humiliation burned worse than any combat damage. He could see the airfield now. The familiar runways, the dispersal areas, the control tower. Safety. Or what passed for safety in a world that had just turned upside down. Then something made him look up. High above, contrails were forming, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They stretched from horizon to horizon, a vast web of white lines against the blue sky. Not bomber contrails, fighter contrails. The radio confirmed what he was seeing. All stations. Radar reports massive fighter formations entering German airspace. Estimate 300 plus bandits. Repeat, 300 plus. 300 American fighters. The number was incomprehensible. It was more fighters than the entire Luftwaffe had deployed during the Battle of Britain. And they were all deep inside Germany, all at once. Müller's mind struggled to process the scale. 300 fighters represented industrial capacity beyond anything Germany could match. It represented training programs that could produce pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of air power that no amount of German skill or courage could overcome. He was on final approach now, his landing gear down, his flaps set. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but everything felt different. The world had changed in the 90 minutes he'd been airborne. The 2 P-47s broke away as he crossed the airfield boundary, climbing away with casual ease. Their job was done. They'd escorted him home, demonstrated their superiority, and lived to fight another day. His wheels touched down, the familiar bump and rumble of the landing roll. As he slowed, he looked to the east, where the contrails still formed their ominous patterns. The sky belonged to the Americans now. Everyone on the ground could see it. Every pilot still in the air knew it. He taxied to his dispersal area and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He sat there for a long moment, his hands still on the controls, staring at the instrument panel without seeing it. The ground crew approached, their faces expectant. They hadn't seen the battle, hadn't witnessed the revolution that had just occurred in the skies above Germany. They still lived in the old world, where German fighters dominated and American technology was inferior. One of them, a young mechanic named Klaus, reached up to help him out of the cockpit. "Tough mission, Herr Oberleutnant." Müller didn't answer. He climbed down slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked at the sky again. The contrails were thickening, spreading, forming a canopy of white that stretched as far as he could see. Then he saw them, not contrails this time, but aircraft. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, flying in perfect formation. They weren't bombers. They were P-47s, flying so low he could see their distinctive razorback silhouettes clearly. They weren't attacking. They weren't diving on targets. They were flying a victory lap over one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighter bases. As the first formation passed directly overhead, so low he could see the individual pilots in their cockpits, one of the Thunderbolts did something that made every German on the ground freeze. It rocked its wings twice, the universal aerial signal for "you're hit" or "I got you." Then the radio in the control tower, set to the emergency frequency all aircraft monitored, crackled to life. An American voice, calm and clear, speaking in slightly accented German. "Attention Juvincourt airfield. This is Captain John Mitchell, 56th Fighter Group. We'll be seeing you again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that." The transmission ended. The Thunderbolts continued their flyover, then climbed away to the west, their engines roaring a final, defiant message. Müller stood there, watching them disappear, the Knight's Cross heavy around his neck, the 48 victory marks on his aircraft suddenly meaningless. He looked at the young mechanic standing beside him, whose face showed a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. "They told us they were inferior," the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Müller didn't respond. He was still watching the sky where the American fighters had been, still processing the scale of what he'd witnessed, still trying to understand how everything could have changed so completely, so quickly. Then he saw something else, something that made the blood drain from his face, something that made him understand this wasn't just a bad day or a temporary reversal. High above, where the contrails were thickest, new shapes were emerging. Not the familiar silhouettes of P-47s or P-38s, but something different. Something nobody in German intelligence had predicted. Something that shouldn't have been possible for at least another year. They were sleek, elegant, deadly. And they were diving on the remaining German fighters with a speed that made the P-47s look slow. Müller's radio, still tuned to the emergency frequency, crackled one more time. An American voice, different from the first, filled with the exhilaration of someone testing a new weapon for the first time in combat. "Okay, you guys, watch this. These Krauts have never seen anything like." The transmission cut off in a burst of static, but the new shapes descending from the heavens needed no narration. They were unlike anything Karl Müller had ever seen, sleek, impossibly streamlined, with a radical new wing design that looked like a straight line swept back at a sharp angle. They possessed a brutal, predatory elegance that made even the formidable P-47s appear clunky and dated. They fell upon the scattered remnants of the German fighter formations like hawks among sparrows, their speed so immense they seemed to warp the very air around them. Müller stood frozen on the tarmac, his hand still resting on the warm metal of his 109's fuselage, his mind refusing to accept the evidence of his eyes. These were the P-51 Mustangs, a name he wouldn't learn until days later, but in that moment they were simply the embodiment of a future the Reich could not hope to match. The first engagement was less a dogfight and more an execution. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, desperately trying to regain altitude after a tussle with a Thunderbolt, never saw the new American fighter coming. The Mustang, diving from over 35,000 feet, closed the distance in a blink. There was no prolonged turning fight, no energy maneuvering contest. It was a single, slashing pass. A brief, bright wink of gunfire from the Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns, and the FW-190's right wing tore away from the fuselage in a cloud of shredded metal and fuel. The German fighter cartwheeled once, then spun into the earth, leaving a black smear across the French countryside. The Mustang never slowed, never turned to confirm the kill. It simply continued its dive, becoming a speck aimed at the next victim, its speed a terrifying assertion of dominance. On the ground at Juvincourt, the silence was profound. The ground crew, the mechanics, the other pilots who had managed to limp home, all stared skyward, their earlier bravado evaporated. The low, mocking flyover of the P-47s had been a humiliation. This was a declaration of annihilation. The young mechanic Klaus finally found his voice, a tremor of disbelief in it. What? What are those, Herr Oberleutnant? Müller could only shake his head, his throat tight. The technical reports, the intelligence briefings that had so confidently detailed the limitations of American engineering, they were not just wrong, they were fairy tales. The reality was here, screaming through the skies above his airfield. The P-51's laminar flow wing, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard, its range that would soon dwarf even the improved P-47s. These were not incremental improvements. They were a quantum leap. And they had arrived not in a year, not in 6 months, but today, at the precise moment the Luftwaffe was reeling from the Thunderbolt's shocking capabilities. The rest of that day passed in a fog of stunned disbelief. The debriefing was a somber, chaotic affair, held in the makeshift briefing room that smelled of damp wool, cold coffee, and fear. Of the 24 Bf 109s from Jagdschwader II that had scrambled from Juvincourt that morning, only 7 had returned. 4 pilots were confirmed killed, 3 were missing and presumed dead, and 7 had bilayed out over German territory, some with injuries. The losses were catastrophic, but it was the nature of the defeat that was truly chilling. Lieutenant Hans Vogel, his hands still trembling slightly, described being herded by the P-47s. It was as if they knew every move I was going to make before I made it, Herr Major, he reported, his voice hollow. They weren't just reacting, they were dictating the fight, and when I tried to dive away, "Sir, nothing in our manual says a P-47 can catch a 109 in a dive. Nothing." Another pilot, a veteran Oberfeldwebel with 63 missions, simply stated, "They have rewritten the book on aerial combat in a single morning. Our book is obsolete." The Gruppenkommandeur Major Strauss, a hardened veteran of the Battle of Britain with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, listened in grim silence. He had received fragmentary reports from other units, and the picture they painted was one of a front-wide collapse. The carefully coordinated defense of the Reich fighter boxes had been shattered. The strategy of holding back fighters until the American escorts turned for home had been rendered null and void. The Americans weren't just escorting the bombers to the target. They were conducting fighter sweeps, clearing the skies of German aircraft with impunity. That evening, a top-secret teletype arrived from Luftwaffe High Command. It was a frantic, contradictory document, first demanding an explanation for the unacceptable loss rates, then issuing impossible new tactical directives. It ordered units to avoid direct engagement with enemy escorts whenever possible, and to focus all efforts on the destruction of the bomber formations, a tactic that had just been proven suicidal. The final paragraph, a masterpiece of delusion, attributed the day's setbacks to temporary local technical advantages and inferior command decisions at the unit level. There was no admission that the entire foundational intelligence assessment of American air power had been a catastrophic failure. Müller retreated to his quarters, the Knight's Cross feeling like a lead weight on his neck. He sat on the edge of his cot, the photograph of Lena in his hand. Her smiling face, once a source of comfort, now seemed to accuse him. What was he fighting for? A future that these new American war machines were systematically obliterating from the sky. He thought of the confident, almost bored tone of the American pilot who had transmitted over the airfield. "We'll be seeing you again tomorrow." It wasn't a threat, it was a simple statement of fact. The Americans owned the watch, and they would decide when the blows would fall. The following days became a grim, bloody rhythm of attrition. The Americans returned just as Captain Mitchell had promised, and the day after, and the day after that. The great, swirling dogfights of early 1943 were replaced by brutal, one-sided slaughters. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots at an unsustainable rate. In the first 2 weeks after what became known within the German fighter arm as the Schweinfurt catastrophe, JG2, lost another 19 pilots killed or missing. The replacement pilots arriving from training schools were boys, some with as little as 100 hours of total flight time, sent up against American veterans who had already survived dozens of missions. They were called mayor's meat by the grim veterans, a dark joke about the Luftwaffe's chief of training. Müller's own skills, honed over 4 years and 48 victories, were now merely a means of survival, not of triumph. He became cautious, calculating, avoiding fair fights whenever possible. He scored his 49th and 50th victories during this period. A P-47 he caught by surprise during a low-level melee, and a B-17 his swarm managed to isolate for a few precious seconds. But there was no celebration. Each kill felt more like luck than skill, a temporary stay of execution in a war that was rapidly being lost. The confident hunter had become the hunted, his every sortie a nerve-shredding exercise in risk management. The technological shockwave emanating from that single day in October rippled outwards, affecting every aspect of the German war machine. At the Focke-Wulf plant in Bremen, engineers worked in a state of near panic, desperately trying to develop high-altitude variants of the FW-100 and 90 to counter the P-51. They bolted on bulky, drag-inducing superchargers and enlarged wings, creating the FW-190D, but the process was slow, hampered by constant bombing raids and material shortages. Meanwhile, in a secret hangar at Richlin, the Luftwaffe's main test center, a team of engineers and intelligence officers pored over the wreckage of a P-51 billion that had crash-landed in a field near Koblenz. Oberleutnant Ernst Fischer, a brilliant aeronautical engineer who had worked on the Me-262 jet program, was summoned to lead the examination. Standing amidst the torn, burnt remains of the Mustang, he felt a profound sense of professional awe mixed with dread. He ran his hand over a section of the wing, its surface impossibly smooth. "Do you see this?" he said to his assistants, his voice low. "The laminar flow design, the precision of the manufacturing. We theorized about this. They have achieved it on an industrial scale." The Merlin engine, though damaged, was a masterpiece of compact power. The engineers calculated its power-to-weight ratio and fell silent. One of them, a young man named Richter, whispered, "Herr Oberleutnant, to match this with our current production, it would take years we do not have." Fischer's report to the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium was brutally frank. "The P-51 Mustang represents a minimum 12-month lead in fighter design and performance over our best operational aircraft," he wrote. "Its combination of speed, range, and high-altitude performance renders our current defensive fighter strategy obsolete. The Me-262 jet fighter is the only possible counter, and it must be prioritized above all other projects." The response from an aide to Reichsmarschall Göring was a single, scribbled line at the bottom of the report. "The Führer is not interested in fantasy aircraft. He demands more FW-190s now." The industrial disparity was a nightmare from which Germany could not awake. While German factories, pounded around the clock by the very bombers the P-51s now escorted, struggled to produce 1,500 fighters of all types per month, American factories were achieving the impossible. In January 1944, alone, the North American aviation plant in Inglewood, California, produced 475 P-51s. The Packard motor car plant in Detroit added another 220 Merlin engines. This was just one model from one manufacturer. The numbers were so vast they became abstract, meaningless to the German pilots facing them daily. For every German fighter shot down, it seemed 3 new American ones appeared in the sky the next day. This industrial tsunami washed over other fronts as well. In the sun-baked skies over the Solomon Islands, a parallel drama was unfolding. Lieutenant Commander Tadao Yamada, a veteran Japanese ace of the Imperial Japanese Navy with 27 victories to his name, banked his A6 M50 over Bougainville. The Zero had been the terror of the Pacific in 1942, a nimble, long-range predator that could outturn any Allied fighter. Yamada, like Müller, was a product of his machine's early dominance. He believed in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior pilot, the Yamato Damasha, which would ultimately triumph over American material wealth. On the morning of February 15, 1944, he led his shot eye of 3 Zeros to intercept a reported formation of American bombers. He found them, a box of B-24 Liberators, but circling high above were not the stubby, familiar F-4F Wildcats but sleek, twin-boomed Shadows, P-38 Lightnings. Yamada dismissed them. The Zero could outturn the Lightning easily. He gave the signal to attack. The ensuing combat was a brutal lesson in technological evolution. The P-38s, equipped with new paddle blade propellers and boosted engines, did not try to turn with the Zeros. They used their superior speed and dive performance in slashing, hit-and-run attacks. Yamada watched in horror as his wingman, a young ensign named Kato, tried to follow a Lightning in a climbing turn. The P-38 simply powered away, then rolled over and came back down, its concentrated fire of a 20 cannon and 450 caliber machine guns tearing the fragile Zero apart. There was no drama, no prolonged duel. It was a clinical, mechanical kill. Yamada himself only escaped by diving into a cloud, his heart pounding. The myth of the Zero's invincibility shattered just as completely as the myth of the 109's superiority had been over Schweinfurt. He would later write in his diary, "We are not fighting men anymore. We are fighting factories that fly." Back in Europe, the strategic impact of the American fighter supremacy became terrifyingly clear with the approach of Operation Overlord. In the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was systematically bled white. The USAAF's Big Week in February saw thousands of bombers, protected by swarms of P-51s and P-47s, pulverize German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe had to commit its fighters to defend the means of their own production, and in doing so, they were destroyed in staggering numbers. In April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 500 fighter pilots in the West alone. They were losses that could not be replaced. The average training time for a new German pilot had plummeted to under 150 hours. Their American counterparts had over 300, and many of their commanders had over 500 combat hours. Karl Müller witnessed this erosion firsthand. His staffel was now a collection of hollow-eyed veterans and terrified replacements who barely knew how to take off in formation. The confident banter of the mess hall was gone, replaced by a weary silence. When the invasion of Normandy finally came on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Müller flew 2 sorties over the beaches that day. The sky was a solid wall of Allied aircraft, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, Spitfires, Typhoons. He saw a few FW-190s bravely try to attack the invasion fleet, only to be swarmed by a dozen P-47s and torn to pieces. He never even got close to the beaches. He spent both missions desperately defending himself, using his last reserves of skill and luck just to make it back to a hastily prepared landing strip. The sight of the thousands of ships crowding the channel, completely immune from air attack, was the final, crushing confirmation of their defeat. The Allies owned the sky, and thus, they owned the earth beneath it. The final, personal collapse came from Müller in late July 1944. His Gruppe was ordered on a near-suicide mission to intercept B-17s bombing oil refineries near Leipzig. It was the same kind of mission they had flown 100 times before, but the context had vanished. They were met by a wall of P-51s. In the swirling, desperate fight, Müller saw Hans Vogel's 109 take a direct hit from a Mustang's guns. There was no fire, no explosion. The aircraft simply fell apart, the wings folding back and tearing away. He didn't see a parachute. Vogel, the fresh-faced optimist, was gone, another entry in a ledger of loss that was growing exponentially. Minutes later, Müller found a Mustang on his own tail. He threw his 109 into every evasive maneuver he knew: snap rolls, hard brakes, sudden dives. The Mustang, piloted by a Lieutenant Robert Bob Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, stayed with him effortlessly. Tracers streaked past Müller's canopy. He felt impacts shudder through his airframe. Smoke began to pour from his engine and his oil pressure dropped to zero. The end was here. He was out of tricks, out of luck, out of time. He thought of Lena one last time, then reached for the canopy release. He yanked it, and the canopy tore away in the slipstream. He released his harness and was sucked out of the dying aircraft, the force of the ejection slamming into him like a train. His parachute opened with a comforting jolt, and he swung silently beneath the silk, a tiny, insignificant speck in a sky ruled by his enemies. He landed hard in a farmer's field, spraining his ankle. He was captured within an hour by a pair of very young, very confident American military policemen. As they drove him to a temporary POW cage, their truck passed a long column of Sherman tanks and trucks, all moving east. It seemed to stretch to the horizon. One of the MPs, noticing his gaze, said with a casual grin, "That's the express train to Berlin, Kraut, all aboard." Müller said nothing. He looked at the endless stream of men and machines, and he thought of the hundreds of Mustangs he had seen that day. He wasn't looking at an army. He was looking at the physical manifestation of that industrial capacity he had first glimpsed over Schweinfurt. It was an unstoppable force. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in England. It was there, in the monotony of captivity, that he finally had the time to fully process the revolution he had witnessed. He met other pilots from different fronts, and they all told variations of the same story: the shocking appearance of a new Allied weapon that rendered their training, their tactics, and their courage irrelevant. They had been defeated not by better men, but by a better system, a system of innovation, production, and logistics that their nations could not comprehend, let alone match. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Müller was repatriated to a shattered Germany in late 1946. He found his hometown in ruins, and Lena was gone, her family having moved away during the war. The Knight's Cross was at the bottom of a trunk, a relic from a different epoch. He eventually found work as a mechanic for Luftwaffe, his skilled hands now fixing the peaceful cousins of the machines he had once fought against. One day in 1955, a new American airliner, a Lockheed Constellation, landed for servicing. Its graceful, powerful lines reminded him unsettlingly of the P-38. A young American pilot, about the same age Müller had been in 1943, strolled across the tarmac, laughing with his co-pilot. He had the same easy confidence, the same assumption of superiority, that Captain Mitchell's voice had held over the radio at Juvincourt. It was not a martial confidence anymore, but a commercial, industrial one. The battle had simply moved to a different arena, and the outcome, Müller realized with a weary finality, was just as preordained. He looked up at the sky, clear and empty of contrails, and thought of Hans Vogel, of the 48 swastikas on his cockpit, of the deafening roar of 1,000 engines over Normandy. They had believed they were fighting for the fatherland, for glory, for an ideology. But in the end, they had simply been on the wrong side of an equation. Karl Müller, the ace, the knight of the air, had been broken against the immutable mathematics of industrial production. The final, devastating statistic echoed in his mind. By war's end, the United States had built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs and nearly 16,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. The Third Reich, in its entire existence, had produced roughly 35,000 Messerschmitt Bf 109s of all variants. The Americans had outproduced them in fighters alone, and then they had built the bombers, the tanks, the ships. They had not fought an army. They had fought a nation that had mastered the art of making things, and on that field there could be only one victor. He turned his back on the constellation and walked slowly toward the hangar, the ghost of a roaring engine forever chasing him.